my name is Chantal. I'll be talking to you tonight about the flight plan messaging in iCAS. A very short overview of what I'm going to be talking to you about. I'll be introducing myself a little bit. I will be introducing the LVNL a little bit, which is the Air Traffic Control the Netherlands. I'll be talking to you about iCAS and what iCAS is. I'll be talking to you about the Single European Sky, which is mostly why iCAS is. I'll be talking to you about flight plans, about the testing of flight plans, about automating flight plans, the challenges we face with iCAS, the future of iCAS, and then we'll be doing a roundup where you can ask all your questions. But like Natalie said, we do use a lot of abbreviations. I have tried to explain them as I go, but if at any point anything I'm saying is unclear or you've lost track, please let me know in the chat and I will try to answer them as best I can. A little bit about me. That is me. This is taken just after I passed my multi-engine instrument rating in November 2020. The multi-engine bit seems fairly self-explanatory. It's plane with 2 engines. The instrument rating just means that it's an add-on to a pilot license that lets you fly above or through clouds. We'll get back to that on flight plans. There's a specific bit for that. I passed my instrument rating after starting flight school in 2019. Before starting flight school, I studied biology. I got a bachelor's in biology. I got a teaching degree, and I taught biology to kids aged 12 to 15. And then afterwards, I did absolutely none of that. I went to IT. I joined Capgemini, and I've been with the Dutch Air Traffic Control since July 2021. When people talk about air traffic control, most people think about the tower, which is absolutely correct. We have towers. We've got 5 of them, to be precise. 5 civil towers. We've got the most famous one, which is Schiphol Tower. We've got Rotterdam, Groningen, Lelystad, and Maastricht. But in addition to all the tower airspace, the Air Traffic Control Netherlands, LVNL, is in charge of all civilian airspace. We've got airfields that don't have a tower, that aren't regulated. For example, Hilversum, which is quite popular with general aviation traffic. And we've got towers that aren't civil, but that are military. For example, Eindhoven Airport, for anyone who thought I missed out on that one. The airspace that's under control of LVNL is all the airspace in the Netherlands, which is bordered by the German airspace on the east, the Belgian airspace on the south, the British airspace on the west, and the Danish on the north. And it extends from ground level up until flight level 245. And very briefly, flight level is a way of measuring altitude. But based on standard pressures, because altitude is just measuring distance going up. We measure in hectopascals, but you could imagine that since the weather is quite diverse in various places, the pressure isn't the same at the place where you left and the place where you're going. So to make sure that airplanes aren't flying at the same altitude when you're going on your holiday, we use standard pressure setting, because if the pressure is different at your destination than it is from your departure aerodrome, you might be flying at the same altitude because the pressure is so different that when you're at 6,000 feet and the other plane is at 7,000 feet, they're actually at the same altitude. So to prevent that, we use a standard pressure setting, and when we use that one, it's called a flight level and not an altitude. We'll get back to that on flight plans as well. Then what is iCAS? iCAS stands for the ITEC Center Automation System, where iCAS stands for Interoperability through European Collaboration, for anyone who was doubting how much we love abbreviations. And iCAS is going to replace the current system, which is called AAA, for Amsterdam Advanced ATC, Air Traffic Control System. iCAS is going to be a modular system, and it's going to allow for innovation, like I've mentioned here, recat CBS, which is the recategorization mostly of wake turbulence categories and time-based separation, which allows for an increase in capacity. It might also reduce noise pollution, as it can give airplanes better climb profiles, which means less throttle movements, which means less noise, also less fuel, which is lovely. And then not unimportant, it's very similar to systems in other countries. So the Germans are building an iCAS-based system, the Brits are building an iCAS-based system. The Norwegians are, the Polish and the Lithuanians are as well. And that's actually a big part of the Single European Sky, because the Single European Sky is set to reduce fragmentation of airspace. Some of the goals of Single European Sky are to increase airspace capacity, to reduce air traffic management costs, to increase safety by a tenfold factor, and to reduce environmental impact by about 10%, which are quite lofty goals. And like I said, the aim is to reduce airspace fragmentation. I've got a bit of airspace here, which is a cross-section. And as you can see, there's a lot of different bits of airspace. Just because I think it's interesting, the tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of yellow all the way on the bottom, that's actually the amount of airspace that the tower controllers have, which is quite a bunch, but respectively, not all that much. To make things even more confusing, I've brought this lovely chart. This one shows flight information region, which is the designation of airspace controllers, mostly for general air traffic, where they can get information on other traffic, mostly for safety reasons. And as you can see, it's a bit of a mess, so we're going to zoom in so you can actually see what we're talking about. This one shows a bit of the borders between Netherlands and Germany. There's a lot of black lines, which are airways. The airways are interspersed by waypoints. Waypoints are characterized by having 5-character names. They actually help navigation. There's Arnhem, which is situated above Arnhem. Nijkerk above Nijkerk, not on here, but Groningen near Groningen. So it actually does help with navigation. And these are the routes that planes fly. So these will come back on the flight plan as well, just so that you have a little bit of an idea what we're looking at. The big green circles are airfields, the one that cross through them, civil ones, the one with a green circle in them, military ones. And then as you can see, in Germany, the northern half is the Bremen Fair, and the other down south half is the Langen Fair, which just shows that German airspace is so big, even they can't have to bring it up into spaces in order to be able to manage it. Single European Sky aims to reduce that, so they want to go to functional airspace blocks, which is nice, because that means that if you take your flight and you're going on a holiday to Spain, instead of having your plane go from Dutch airspace to Belgium airspace, having to call the Belgians, and then going to French airspace, having to call the French, and then going to Spanish airspace, having to call the Spanish, you can just hand them over once from the one airspace block to the other, which does look a lot nicer. Then, like I said, the flight gets handed over. It's nice for the other air traffic centers if they know what kind of flight they're getting. And they could call Belgium and say, hey, we've got a flight coming. It's coming from Amsterdam. It's going to Madrid. We've got a lot of people on board. We want to fly this route. We want to fly it at that speed. We want to be at this altitude. And then they can talk for another half an hour. But they don't really have time for that. So instead, they use flight plan messages, which contains all the information about a flight that you could ever possibly want. And I'll try to be brief and talk you through it, because my introduction is actually quite long. On the left, we see a flight plan. A flight plan, like I said, is a summary of the flight details. It's mandatory for all international flights. It's highly encouraged for all other flights. And without one, most flights that use instrument flight rules can't actually go into controlled airspace, but I'll talk you through that as I explain what a flight plan is. So on the top, under number 7, we've got aircraft identification, which we tend to call a call sign. It's the name of the flight that you see on the radar screens, and it's also what the air traffic controllers call when they want to communicate with a plane, so that they know that they're talking to you and not to one of the other planes in the sky. We've got flight rules. I mentioned at the beginning that I got an instrument rating. If you have an instrument rating, all that means is that you're allowed to use instrument flight rules, so you can fly through clouds above ground. If you don't have that, all you can do is fly with ground reference, which we call VFR, visual flight rules. So we fill that in here. There's actually 4 options. There's the V for VFR, the I for IFR, and then there's Yankee and Zulu for flights that start out IFR and go VFR, or flights that start out VFR and go IFR. Based on what kind of flight rules they have, the flight plans get processed by different systems, which is why it's relevant for the testing that we'll be talking about shortly. Then there's the type of flight. It can be scheduled, non-scheduled, military, general aviation, or other. Other tend to be training flights. If it's other, it tends to be put into field 18, where you can put any kind of remarks, and then they'll specify what kind of flight it is. Then there's the type of aircraft, because there's quite a difference, obviously, between an Airbus A380 and a tiny little Cessna, or the one that I was flying at the very beginning. The wake turbulence that I mentioned when we were talking about the recut TBS for a tiny little bit. And then again, more important stuff, the departure aerodrome and the destination aerodrome and the entire route. Because based on what you put in those fields, the flight plan gets sent to different places. It'll obviously go to the departure aerodrome, the destination aerodrome, but also all the other airspace that it will be passing through. So Schiphol doesn't need any information on flights that are in the United States, so we're not getting any of that. However, it does want to know all the planes that are flying through on their way from London to Austria, just because it's nice to know what planes are in your airspace. And then there's field 18, which I mentioned. You can put basically anything. It's currently got the date of flight that I took a screenshot of this flight plan, which is the 18th of April. There's some software that you can use to fill in flight plans, and they will automatically put in a line that sends a copy of your flight plan to their headquarters so that they can analyze statistics on all the people that file flight plans, where they're going, what they're using, where they're flying to, how often they use their software, which I'm sure is interesting for all kinds of statistics. And then there's a lot more information, but I'll skip through that because you don't want to be here tomorrow, I'm sure. So this is where we test all the information that has just been put into a flight plan. This is Polaris. Polaris is our acceptance environment. So we've got iCAS on all these computers, all the controller working positions, all the subsystems are in here. And this is where we run our tests. So we've got two modes for testing. We've got iSim, which is a simulation. We can put in any kind of flight plan, and this is nice for testing all kinds of functions that you wouldn't want to test with actual live aircraft, such as conflict detection. But we can also put it in live data shadow, which, as the name suggests, uses live data. But then because obviously we're a system under test and we don't want to be interacting with real actual aircraft, it's a shadow. So we don't interact with those. We can just look at them and analyze all the data. So we've got connections to all the subsystems. The messages come in a specific format. It sends them back in a specific format. The content has already been tested in the subsystem tests. And then the most things that we're looking at is if the sender and receiver are configured in the right way so that the messages come in from the right place and they're going to the right place so that we can make sure that they're processed correctly. We've actually been testing this earlier today, and we had quite an interesting case. There was a flight coming in, and we were watching this in live data shadow. So these were actual real life flights. And it was a flight coming in from Manchester. It was going to Sofia in Bulgaria. And it wasn't supposed to go through Dutch airspace, so we didn't have any information on this, which was one of our test cases. And I was really enthusiastic about it because we don't often get diversions that don't have anything to do with Dutch airspace initially. And for some reason, it got diverted to Schiphol Airport, and all that we got in our system was a message stating that aircraft has landed at Schiphol Airport, it's arrived, which is lovely. But then in our test case, we expected more messages, such as the initial flight plan message that has all the details on the flight. And then we couldn't find any of those. So we spent a long time looking in the system, trying to figure out if it had ended up in a queue, if there was any kind of error message in it. We went through the database that's got all the messages that's been through iCAS in the past 30 days. And then we still couldn't figure it out. And so one of my colleagues said that we could just walk over to the room with all the actual controllers in them, ask if they had any idea what happened to the flight. And off we went. And the guy who had handled the flight actually was still there. And he talked us through it. It was a flight that was just north of the Netherlands, probably in Danish airspace. And the procedure that we had prepared in our test case is that they control Eurocontrol, which controls the airspace above the Netherlands, that they would send us all the flight plan messages that have been sent so far so that we're up to speed with all the information. And that then the flight would be handed over to the controllers at Schiphol. They would guide the plane to Schiphol and have it land there, and then the arrival message would be sent. But instead, they just contacted Schiphol Airport. They made a tiny little flight plan called a mini plan with all the basic information without any of the additional messages, any of the additional information, just what it needs so that they can select it on their working position and send it off to Schiphol to land. And that's what they did. So it turns out there weren't any additional messages. So now we still have to go look through all the other data and find a different diversion to get that test case sorted. So this is what we test. This is where we test it. That is how we test most of it. When we've got all the test cases done, we plan on automating them. There's about 87 tools that we've got from our software supplier, Indra. Some of those can be used for automation, and the one that we're currently using for automation is called iSniffer. It works, you can switch it on, then it keeps track of all the messages that come in. You can switch it off again, then it obviously stops watching all the messages that come in. We call it sniffing. It's quite fun. And then you can make keywords that will look into the database that's just been put together based on the actual data of actual planes that were flying seconds ago, using actual production data, and search for whatever message you're looking for. So for the plane that had just arrived, the diverted one, we could look for an arrival message coming in from a specific airport, going to a specific airport, looking for specific dates, flights, specific call signs, specific aircraft type, specific flight rules, you name it, we can look for it. Meaning that we could automate any of the cases that we have, because all the flight plan messages, they're in there. Some of the challenges that we face building iCAS at the scale, because it's quite a big project, as you could see just from the acceptance environment, which is huge. There's a lot of system, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of subsystems. Another challenge is that it must look like our current system, AAA, because all the controllers have been trained on AAA, and if they get an entirely different system, they can't use it. So we don't want to train them all on a new system, because then they can no longer use the old system. There's going to be a switch over. So it must look the same. And then as long as we're still using AAA, every change that we make in AAA will also have to be put into iCAS, because otherwise it will no longer look like AAA. So there's going to be a cutoff where we can no longer make any changes, because otherwise you'll just be developing iCAS ad infinitum, because you'll be developing AAA, and then why would we build a new system? Another challenge is that I mentioned at the beginning, we're doing a project which is called One Air Traffic Management, which will be for both civil and military controllers. So it'll have to be a system that both can use. And then for the testing, we've got the little hurdle that it's dependent on the availability of all the subsystems. So I mentioned before that the content of all the messages is checked before, so that we just check that the messages are coming in from the right place, going to the right place, and that we have already checked that the content's correct. In order to be able to test that, the system has to be available, but there's plenty more tests to be run on iCAS than just the flight plan messaging. So the schedule of that is sometimes a bit tricky. Then for the future, there will be add-ons eventually. They can be by our own design, they can be from the ITAC collaboration, or they can be existing tools that are already used by other air navigation service providers. An example of that one would be Intelligent Approach, that is currently being used. I think it's Heathrow. They used Recat TBS in that one in order to optimize capacity even more, and it's a pretty nifty system. And there's obviously the interaction with the other air navigation service providers. So like I mentioned, there will be more providers using an iCAS-based system. And when we actually have a single European sky, it will be possible to interact earlier with flights. So before they get into the Dutch airspace, which currently isn't possible because it's not our airspace. And that very briefly is an introduction to iCAS and the tests that we're doing and the flight plan messaging system. So if there's any questions, I'm sure Natalie will mention them
Yes,
to me
there are
shortly.
questions. It's like already, I think a lot of people would like to have some of the answers that are already there. First of all, already thank you, but let's get to the questions. Sanne asked the first one. So did they build an entire new floor building just to test this system?
Basically, yes.
Yep.
Yeah. So the plan is currently it's an acceptance environment, and then when we're done testing it, we won't just tear it down again. The idea is that while iCAS is being tested, we'll have AAA run as a backup during a transition phase. And then by the time iCAS goes live, we'll be running iCAS from where it is now in the acceptance environment. While it's running there, we will change the room where the current system is, put iCAS in there, and then we'll turn the current acceptance environment into a big training floor. So yes, we did build it to test the system, but it will be repurposed.
Get envy in my office because it will be my testing space.
Basically, yes.
Yes. So yes, it's an entire new building for a test system.
Yeah.
The next question is of Konrad Braam. These messages are a protocol of sorts. How do you plan for integration and version updates coming from people using a terminal to file a plan from a greenfield, airfield, non-upgraded terminal?
I think if there's anything with the messages that isn't up to specs as we would expect it currently, it'll be queued. There is a specific working position that's called the flight data operator, where all the flight plans are accessible, and any flight plan that has anything that iCAS doesn't recognize gets put into the queue, where an actual human will look at it, look at why it's in the queue, what needs fixing. And like I said, there's a field 18 where you can put basically anything. If there's a phone number, which I tend to put on my personal flight plans, if they can't figure out what it's supposed to say, they'll give you a call so that they know what it should say and they can fix it and you're good to go.
Just wondering why people keep putting their mobile phones on.
No, it's there. And then if you're doing a VFR flight and you forget to close your flight plan, they'll assume that you haven't made it back to the airport. They'll send out search and rescue, which is a humongous operation. So to prevent sending out search and rescue, they'll try to call you too.
Okay.
And then because I'm so scared, I'll forget to close it. I always put my phone number there so that they know.
Okay. So Conrad has another question. Military users, for example, will not want to upgrade continuously. Is this a special test domain for you?
I'm not actually sure what the plans are for the military systems. I'm sure that someone in my team will know, but personally I don't. So if it's something you really want to know, I can look into it for you, but I don't quite know as of now. You happen to know it?
Yeah, so yes, because you mentioned in your talk, you already mentioned one ATM.
Yes.
So one of the projects that we also run at Air Traffic Control is that the military and the LVNL traffic controllers will use the same system. Obviously, they are now a bit in a, they used to be in a separate system. AAA is already used by both. And the one ATM will even integrate more so that they will have one system. Yes, and what is good enough for air traffic controllers of the LVNL is good enough for the air traffic controllers of the military. So, so yes, they have to keep up with the changes and also be trained in that case. But there's another question again. Take them time. Snurby, do commercial aircraft need to upgrade their equipment to contribute to the new iCAS system?
No, they don't. Or at least not that I'm aware of. I know that there's a lot of new equipment for planes. There's a lot of new regulations regarding navigation performance. And there's planes that aren't allowed to use specific airways because they're not able to navigate accurately enough for the specific airways. I don't think it's the other way around yet. I think that due to iCAS being an upgrade to the current systems, that they can track them more accurately, but I don't think the planes need to change anything. It's just so that they're up to speed.
Conrad says, sounds like a good plan though, thank you.
So. You're welcome.
Well, I also had some questions myself.
Great.
I always get the honor of having some questions. So what happens if a message is not processed correctly?
Yeah, so it's nice to know, obviously, that when a message is sent, it's also actually processed by the system. So to know that the system, when it's processed correctly, sends out an automatic reply which is called a logical acknowledgement message, a LAM. And basically every message that gets sent to iCAS has to receive a LAM in return. And then if it doesn't, we had that in a case not too long ago. It sent out a tower message, a basic flight data message, which had all the information that's in the flight plan. It was expecting a reply, it didn't get one, it gave a timeout, it sent the message again, and then it didn't get a reply, and we had just half an hour worth of BFDs that were being sent that weren't acknowledged, and they just kept on trying. So they end up in the queue I mentioned before. Any kind of message that doesn't conform to specs, it gets queued.
Okay, thank you. Can you find messages from flights that are no longer alive?
Yeah, so the live data that we use from actual flights, everything passes through iCAS. And there's a database in iCAS that collects the data from up to 30 days. So we can go back in there. If we can't find it in the iCAS database, the software that the messages pass through, Amadeus, just the name of the software, I don't know. We can find messages in Amadeus at least half a year back.
Thank you.
So, yes.
So you mentioned it a couple of times, RECAT, TBS and wake turbulence. And I think that some of the people might be curious of what is RECAT. It stands for recategorization, I think, and it has to do with wake turbulence. Can you explain a little bit?
A little bit, yes. So I mentioned on the flight plans that you can put in a wake turbulence category. You can put in one of four. It's either light, medium, heavy, or super heavy, which they basically invented just for the A380s, which is quite nice. But there's a specific amount of separation between those classes. So from light to light, it's about 3 nautical miles. From light to super heavy, it's 8 nautical miles. So you could imagine that if you want to increase your capacity, it would be nice if you don't have to wait 8 nautical miles, because it's quite some distance and therefore also time. So the recategorization is to change those wake turbulence categories from 4 to 6. So some of the heavy and medium ones can be lower heavy and lower medium, which will give them a shorter separation. And then, like I mentioned, you can measure the separation based in time as well, which is the time-based separation. So then instead of having 8 nautical miles distance, it would be 4 minutes-ish, depending on the wind, because the wake turbulence is just the disturbed airflow behind the aircraft.
Okay.
And then if the wind's a crosswind, the disturbed air moves away from the other aircraft. So you can actually move your plane that's behind closer to it, which increases capacity.
Well, thanks for the short.
I know
it's short, but so Conrad asked a question again. General question: if iCAS is good at increasing traffic density, surely that will encourage more flying. Tell us about planned benefits of iCAS that help reduce pollution or flying time.
Actually, if you get denser traffic, you might think that it increases flights. But I think in reality, you will see what they currently do when there's a lot of traffic. They switch over to using 2 runways. So if you can put more traffic on one runway because your capacity is increased, because the distance between the flights is smaller, you could possibly not use that second runway, which prevents noise pollution, because obviously the runway that they use is the preferred one. And then I forgot the other half of the question. Was there another half of the question?
So, tell us about planned benefits of iCAS that help reduce pollution or flying time.
Well, iCAS's main goal is to be able to comply with Single European Sky, which has reduced pollution in general. And they can do it, for example, because the functional airspace blocks give you more airspace to use without having to switch controllers. So they can give more direct routes. For example, if the plane is in France, instead of going to the specific agreed upon routes in Belgium to get onto the specific agreed upon crossover into the Netherlands, you could give it a more direct route through different airspace that otherwise wouldn't be accessible to you.
So it means a shorter flight time.
A shorter flight time, yes. Yeah. Cutting corners.
Bramsnor, hopefully. It's like I need glasses. So my arms are too short. What will the transition period look like? Will LVNL switch from AAA to iCAS, or will both systems function together for a while before shutting down AAA?
They will run together for a while before shutting down AAA. I think the current plan is to run it on a very, very, very slow night. I'm not sure what night's less busy, but I'm sure they figured it out. So they'll run it for just a single night only with AAA as a backup. See how it goes, see whatever problems they run into. If that goes well, 2 nights, a weekend, a week. And then eventually, when they're absolutely sure that it's working, they'll go out AAA as the backup and just go live on iCAS.
Yep. Conrad says, very clear. Yes, thanks.